Now we're going to dive into the realms of mystical, magical, and mysterious Mercury. As far as traditional astrology is concerned, all of the other planets have a set nature associated with them. Saturn is thought to be cold and dry and therefore melancholic and corresponding with the earth element. Jupiter is thought to be hot and wet and therefore sanguine and corresponding with the air element. Mars is thought to be hot and dry, choleric and therefore corresponding with the fire element, as the Sun is also thought to be a hot and dry, choleric, fiery planet. Venus is thought to be hot and moist, sanguine, and corresponding with the air element. The Moon is also thought to be hot and moist, sanguine, and corresponding with the air elements to a very large degree, even though we know that the Moon is also corresponding tangentially with the water element as a result of her rulership over that element in general, which we can see when we observe the ebb and flows of the tides in relation to the magnetic pull of the Moon. All of these planets, we find a distinct nature associated with the planet within the context of Ptolemy's philosophy that he outlines within the Tetrabiblos. However, when it comes to Mercury, we find something very strange occurring. In the Tetrabiblos, Ptolemy tells us that Mercury is wet as a result of his proximity to the Moon and the Earth, and also dry as a result of the speed of his movement. Therefore, we find that Mercury is the only planet that has the ability to hold within himself these opposing qualities of wetness and dryness, whereas all of the other planets within the Chaldean order have complementary qualities. And within this philosophy, every planet is consisting of both an agent that comes first and a patient that comes second. So in the Sun, the combination of hot and dry is representing a combination of one agent, heat, and one patient, dryness, within the constitution of the Sun. Whereas within Saturn, for example, we're having the combination of cold and dry, where cold is the agent and dryness is the patient. And since the agent is the active force within that combination, the agent is always listed first, followed by the patient. And the same thing is true for all of the other planets within the Chaldean order, with the exception of Mercury. Because Mercury is the only planet within the Chaldean order who is holding two patients within himself. Now, what's important for us to know is that the two agents that exist are polar opposites of each other. Therefore, once again, our agents are heat and coldness, or hot and cold, and we're reminded that our two patients are wetness and dryness, or wet and dry. In order for us to maintain some sense of balance within our cosmos, we need for the planets to represent intrinsically a sense of balance within themselves. We technically shouldn't have any planet that has the ability to be wet and dry at the same time, because those two qualities would cancel each other out. Because Mercury is the only planet within Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos that is consisting of two foundationally oppositional principles. We've always thought of Mercury as being weird. We've always thought of Mercury as being somewhat outside of the realm of categorization that we apply to all of the other planets. Now, from an observed astrological perspective, Mercury is always seen near the Sun. Mercury is one of the planets that we call a twilight planet, because we can only see Mercury in the twilight hours just before the rising of the Sun in the morning, and just around the time of the setting of the Sun in the evening. Other than that, mischievous Mercury is nowhere to be found. And this is because from an astrological perspective and from a geocentric perspective, Mercury can be no further than 28 degrees away from the Sun. Mercury is also associated with gateways and crossroads, or periods that are betwixt and between our normal waking reality. This is also part of why, within traditional astrology, the terrestrial house of joy of Mercury is the first house, because we know that the first house is a twilight house insofar as the first house is the nexus, or the crossing point between the deepest darkness of the night and the rising of the sun in the morning. This notion that Mercury is wet and dry has confounded traditional astrologers for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And in the medieval period, we find many of our medieval astrological authorities stating that Mercury was not wet and dry, as Ptolemy said, but that Mercury was a cold and dry planet, therefore making Mercury a melancholic planet, therefore making Mercury, in a sense, associated with the earth element. Now, this makes no sense at all. The notion that Mercury, the fastest moving planet in our solar system with the exception of the Moon, should be considered to be a leaden, earthy planet like Saturn makes no sense whatsoever in both astrological practice or in an observed astronomical practice. There's nothing about Mercury that is associated intrinsically with the earth element. The reason why the ancients thought that Mercury should be given the qualities of cold and dry were, one, because they couldn't understand how Mercury could possibly be wet and dry, and two, because we know that the exaltation sign of Mercury, which is also one of the domiciles of Mercury, is the sign of Virgo, which is indeed a cold and dry, melancholic sign. But we have to ask ourselves, why of the two domiciles of Mercury, Gemini and Virgo, does Mercury have his exaltation in the sign of Virgo? And we also have to ask ourselves, why of the 12 signs of the zodiac should Mercury, once again, weirdly, be the only planet who's having both his domicile or his home as well as his exaltation in the same sign? To the first question, as to why of Mercury's two domiciles Virgo should be his exaltation, what we oftentimes note is that conditions that make planets happy aren't necessarily the same conditions that make people happy. And therefore, even though Mercury, based on his nature as a very erratic, unstable, and air element planet, is a planet that would do far better in the erratic, unstable, and quickly changeable air element sign Gemini, that isn't necessarily going to be the most productive Mercury. So the ancients, in assigning this concept of exaltation to the planets, assigned to Mercury a set of circumstances that would naturally support Mercury in manifesting the best versions of himself possible. Because planets that tend to be very quickly moving, erratic, or mutable in their nature, as are Mercury and the Moon, they need a stable foundation within which to establish their power within this world. Which is why the Moon, another erratic, quickly moving, and potentially volatile planet, is finding her exaltation not in an erratic, volatile, and quickly moving element such as the fire element, the water element, or the air element, but the Moon is finding her exaltation in the densest and most stable of the four elements, being the earth element, because the ancients perceived that the earth element would be that much more stabilizing for the nature of the Moon. And similarly, erratic Mercury was thought to be far more stabilized within an earth element, such as his own domicile in Virgo, than in the erratic, quickly changing, and fluctuating elements of fire, water, and air. Now to the question of why Mercury, of all of the planets, should have both his domicile and exaltation in the same sign of the zodiac, when there are literally 11 other signs of the zodiac that Mercury could have potentially had his exaltation in. A planet as unstable as Mercury is going to need the most fixed and the most stable of the elements as a means of grounding himself. Therefore, we've already taken out of the equation 9 other signs of the zodiac, meaning none of the fire signs are going to be able to give Mercury the stability he needs in order to really fulfill his highest work within the world, because the fire signs would only inflame that which is already erratic and volatile about him. None of the water signs have the ability to give Mercury the sort of stability that he needs, because the nature of the water element is too diffusive. Furthermore, within the context of who Mercury is, the winged god of information and the messenger of the gods in general, the water element would only weigh down and saturate the natural lightness and the natural freedom that we associate with Mercury. Similarly, the air signs, so synonymous with the nature of Mercury are they, that none of them could really give Mercury the level of stability that he would have needed in order to truly establish that which is best about him within our material realm. So we were only left with the 3 signs of the earthy triplicity. We know that in order for Mercury to function, he needs to be in a state of affairs that has some level of mobility. Therefore, overly fixed Taurus would only have been glued to the feet of the messenger of the gods. And in order for Mercury to carry out his functions quickly, he would need to be in a sign that had the ability to be quickly adapting and quickly changing while still being stable. We know that Capricorn, also so deeply associated with Saturn, also would not have been an appropriate sphere for Mercury to be in, because the austerity of Saturn would only have done to Mercury in Capricorn quite the same thing that the fixity and the density of Taurus would have done to him. It would make him slow, sluggish, lethargic, and incapable of carrying out his duties within this world with the speed with which he was intended to carry them out. Therefore, of all the 12 signs of the zodiac, we find the only place that had the ability to hold Mercury truthfully and bring out of Mercury that which is most useful within Mercury was his own domicile of Virgo. And that's why Mercury is having both his domicile and his exaltation in the same sign of the zodiac. I write about all of this in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, in which I go through the rationale behind which all of the classical planets are having their domiciles and their exaltations in the specific signs of the zodiac where we find them. Now, when we look at the glyph of Mercury, we also find another thing that's very curious about this planet. And we see that Mercury is, as far as the classical planets are concerned, the only planet that is holding within himself the 3 component elements that all of the glyphs of the planets are made from. Mercury is having the crescent of the moon standing at the highest point of his glyph, followed by the circle of the sun, followed by the cross of matter. Therefore, within the glyph of Mercury, we're finding the 3 component elements that fundamentally represent the 3 primary tools of creation: the crescent, the circle, and the cross. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that when we draw the glyph of Mercury, it kind of looks like a human being to a very large extent. And this glyph of Mercury is meant to suggest that which is mercurial about all of us, that which is non-tangible within all of us. And Mercury is meant to be the prototype and the key who teaches us how we're meant to be and exist within this world. Within the glyph of Mercury, we're seeing that the crescent of the spirit must always be open, and the crescent of the spirit must always point upward as a means of connecting us to the vital forces that descend into our physical plane and that feed and sustain and maintain our physical lives. We note that the crescent of the moon is representing that which is wild and chaotic, and that which continues to live in the morphic field of possibility within our universe, that which has not yet grasped onto a vital sense of identity, that which is in a constant state of creation, so much so that nothing that she creates is actually standing as its own separate thing, because she is simply representing an ocean of infinite possibility. And this is why the crescent of the moon is a crescent and not fully sealed. The glyph of the moon is open because she cannot hold on to any individual sense of identity. The purpose of the moon is for her to be an infinite field of infinite possibility, and as a result of that, she represents primal chaos. And in order for life to emerge individually, primal chaos has to be pushed to the outskirts, or as we're told within the Kabbalah, God has to carve a hole into the body of infinite darkness. God has to carve a hole into the body of chaos where he can extend his infinite light and radiance, and within that hole that was carved into the solid body of chaos, that is where the substance of our material plane is built. And so the moon is representing that wild, chaotic part of the universe. And within the glyph of Mercury, we are seeing that we, each and every one of us, is connected to that wild, chaotic part of the universe. And all of us are having a root and a direct divine umbilical cord to that deep, dark, infinite chaos, which is on the one hand representing a source of annihilation, but it's also representing a source of utmost creativity. So all of us, by virtue of the moon glyph within the glyph of Mercury, and also the spirit part of our own constitution, we are all connected to the primal materia from which we individually arose. And from that, we then descend into the realm of the individual soul substance that we find within the sun. And so, within this part of Western mysticism, we find that there is a distinct difference between the spirit and the soul. Because the moon glyph within the glyph of Mercury is representing that which is spirit, whereas we see that the soul is essentially a condensation of that spiritual prima materia. The soul is representing the part of us and the part of our spiritual selves that has grasped hold of this vital sense of individuality, that which makes each and every one of us an individual being. That is what's held within the circle part of the Mercury glyph, this idea of the individual soul of each of us. Now, this word soul is a very interesting word, because the ancients did not have a concept for the psyche, the persona, or the personality, as we have these ideas clearly established within our modern psychological framework. For the ancients, when they were referring to those non-tangible parts of ourselves that made us specifically who we are, they ascribed all of those things, our likes, our dislikes, our behaviors, our bad habits, our thoughts, our mentality, how we perceive the world around us, to our soul. This is why at the Oraculos School of Astrology, when we speak about identifying the personality of a person from their birth chart, we refer to the personality as the soul and the psyche of the native. Because this idea of the soul being the personality is something that we find within the deepest part of our traditional astrological framework. So this is what we're finding within the Mercury glyph. This idea that our soul part of ourselves, or in other words, our solar part of ourselves, is fed from the vital life that it receives from the lunar part of ourselves. And finally, within this Mercury glyph, we find the cross of matter, representing the quadripartite nature of our material world. Within the cross of matter, we are finding the fire, the water, the air, and the earth elements represented by the four corners of the cross. Therefore, within the physical human being, what we see being born out of this cross of matter is this idea that our bodies are, in a sense, made up of the elements, which is why one of the terms the ancients had for all living beings within our material world was elementata, or that which is composed of elements. So for the ancients, our bodies represented the elemental part of ourselves that was meant to be ruled by the sovereignty of the soul within us that is connected to the highest, most spiritual source of universal life force, energy, and potency that exists within our universe. This orientation of crescent, circle, and cross is foundationally meant to be how we perceive ourselves as human beings within this world. We're meant to perceive ourselves as having a vehicular body, but we're not meant to be ruled by that body. Which is why one of the things that we find within the mystical teachings of Jesus is that we're meant to be in the world, but not of the world. Because this idea of being of the world is essentially to reverse and defile that which we find in the Glyph of Mercury, where we surmount the world as the cross above our soul, and we use the urges and the impulses of our body to define how we interact with that which is soulful within ourselves, and we completely negate that part of ourselves that is spiritual because we allow ourselves to be fed purely based on things of the flesh. And the reality of being a human being within this physical world is that the fleshy part of our existence is so overwhelming that many of us are living, in a sense, as the Glyph of Mercury reverse. Many of us are living so deeply intoxicated by this illusion of the supremacy of the physical part of ourselves that we don't even have the inkling that indeed there is a ghost within the machine. This is a part of why in the Corpus Hermeticum we find Hermes saying to his son that he shouldn't grieve over people who don't desire to know the truth, and he shouldn't grieve over people who are living in darkness, because those people don't even know that they're living in darkness because of how deeply they're intoxicated by that darkness, and as a result of that, they have no ability to see anything other than the darkness which has become the all-prevailing truth within their lives. However, for those of us who have seen a glimpse of that which is eternal, that is essentially all we need to continue the mercurial task of evolution within this lifetime, so that we can move through the Glyph of Mercury like a ladder from the base elemental part of ourselves into the throne room of our higher selves or our solar identity, and from there to leave behind this idea of a personal incarnation and a personal sense of individuality altogether as we ascend even higher into the realms of the eternal. Do you know that you can become a professional astrologer? If you're ready to take your practice to the next level, then check out our website at oraculosastrology.com and study with us today. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and share it with your other astrological friends, as well as subscribe to the Oraculos podcast wherever you find us on the internet.